Welcome back to Mages and Sages podcast with the old mage Ed Greenwood. I'm Jeff Thetford. That's Curry Russell above me. We have started a new series on our podcast called Thick as Thieves. And what we're trying to do is get together people from the who had a hand in creating the lore around the movie of Dungeons and Dragons. And Curry, you want to start us off?
So this is going to be part one and hopefully a long and ongoing series of featuring the creators, the artists, the writers, the developers of pretty much everything that you saw when you went and saw the movie. We started out with this particular episode with Eric Boyd. One of the fan favorite ideas was the big red dragon found
the fat red dragon.
Yeah, the fat red dragon, Themberchaud. It raised a lot of questions in the realm sphere about, wait a minute, how did Themberchaud get there? From what we know about what's written in the game, there was a lot of unanswered questions, and Eric does a great job of covering a lot of those bases for us and kind of drawing some lines as to why he is where he is and the role he ends up playing in the movie. The reason why we felt that this series was important, and of course we're totally playing off the idea of the brand of the movie, because it's clever, and we thought we could take the Thick as Thieves portion of it and kind of tie it into our friend group and all the guys that we have on the show pretty often, and even some other creators that we've reached out to that had hands in a lot of this original lore that was written before the movie came out, so that maybe just as fans of the show, or maybe people that have been introduced to Dungeons and Dragons through the movie, can understand where some of the themes and the areas and the magic and the spells and the people that were used in the movie, where all of this originated, and give these people their just credit for their contribution to what we saw on the screen, because we all love it. Myself and Jeff and Ed, we've all seen the movie multiple times with friends and family because they want to go and see it with us.
Right, and I bought it. I have it on DVD.
Yeah, they want to have that experience with us. So I just continue to watch it over and over again, and it has become a pretty common staple, not only in the theaters when it was still running, but in my household now as well, because now it's streaming. So we hope you enjoy this first installment of Thick as Thieves.
Oh God, here he goes.
So anyway, this is part one of our series on Thick as Thieves, which is going to be featuring artists or writers who had a hand in pieces of the movie that came out of creating that lore, creating that area of Forgotten Realms that we seem to like so much. Eric.
Yes.
Tell me first. Tell us how you came up with Themberchaud.
Okay. So, and he is the biggest, largest character in the movie. Just really dominates the whole thing. So, yeah, I'm glad we're talking about it.
Me too.
So, well, first off, how old is he? I went back and looked, and while this hasn't been written down, there's a very, very narrow window that he could have been born. So by my reckoning, he was born in the year of the tooth, which is 1270 DR. And his most famous title is Wormsmith of Gracklestug. He is not the first Wormsmith, and he's probably not going to be the last.
He's got several titles, though, right? Father of Flame, Foundry's Heart, the Everburning, correct?
Yeah, those are many of the other ones came out of the Abyss was where they first appeared. When I had written him up originally, he was the Wormsmith of Gracklestug. But I was going to talk through sort of how he got to where he was.
Yeah.
But
please.
Fundamentally, he kept the forges of the City of Blades hot with his fiery breath. He was tended to by an order of Dwergar cleric scions. And he basically slithers around the city, blasting the forges of the city to life with his flame. And in return for this magnanimous service, his hoard is regularly fattened, and he feasts on ill-tempered slaves. All right, so where did he come from? So if we go back a few years to the last millennium, according to my kids, I got to write a product set in the Forgotten Realms. This was second edition. And I was basically given a title, Dret's Do'Urden's Guide to the Underdark, and a page count, 128 pages, and told to go to work. That's literally all they told me.
Wow.
And I'll admit, even the title bothered me because obviously Dritz wasn't my character. He's Bob Salvatore's invention. So the first thing I did was I came up with this framing device where Dritz was sending reports to Illustrial, the High Mage of Silvery Moon, and we knew that they had met in Streams of Silver, the second of Bob's novels. And that way I really didn't have to write the whole thing in Dritz's voice because I was like, I am not going to write 128 pages in the voice of a character I didn't invent. But then I was also inspired by there was a hardcover that Ed had a big hand in that came out around then called Forgotten Realms Adventures. That was bridging the gap from first to second edition. And it did a really, really nice job, the format on detailing some of the cities of the realms above so that you could have adventurers go there and know what to, where do you find the things that adventurers care about, all that kind of stuff. I assume you remember that one, Ed. That was a great product. Really liked that format.
Yeah, I loved it. I'd like to do tons more of those.
Exactly. So I decided I was going to copy that format and I was going to detail the cities of the Underdark. I started out doing the cities of the Underdark, but remember they had a page count, so I ended up doing the cities of the Sword Coast Underdark, not the whole realms. So I didn't know where to start. So basically all I had at the time was there was Gary Gygax's D1 to D3 set in Greyhawk that showed us one version of what the Underdark might look like. And you saw two cities there. You saw, I'm blanking on the name now, of the Greyhawk city. It'll come to me. And you saw the Kuatoa Temple City, right? And so you could kind of see that there were these different settings. And the other thing we had was that Bob had written his novel or his prequel trilogy beginning with Homeland that really gave us a view of Menzoberranzan. And then Bob and Ed had worked together on the Menzoberranzan box set. So that's literally what I had to work from at the time. And so my habit has always been to try to build on little bits of Realms lore and kind of flush them out. And one of those little bits in the Menzoberranzan box set said the following. It said, quote, "The Dwergar here represent an outpost from their distant realm of Gracklestugh, a teeming city located even deeper in the earth than Menzoberranzan and Blingden Stone." And it talks about how they get there across the Dark Lake, etc. That's literally all I had, right? So I was like, okay, I got a name for our city, right? Coming from that book. And my plan was to develop at least one sample city for each of the major Underdark races. And if I did two of them, like if I did two Drow cities, then I wanted them to feel different. So I didn't want any two cities to feel alike, but if I was the first city I did, I wanted to kind of be the archetype, the classic city. And so I decided that Gracklestugh was going to be the equivalent of Menzoberranzan, but for Grey Dwarves. And since Dwergar are lawful, not chaotic like the Drow, I decided that, they probably could actually hold an empire together, which I called the Deep Kingdom, and that Gracklestugh should be the capital of the Deep Kingdom. So now we kind of have our framing device here, right? We have this big city. And I wanted it to be really powerful, large, and wealthy because it was sort of the epitome of the big Dwergar city, not some little side city. But then, I went back and Ed had done this other great product called FR11 Dwarves Deep, and he talked about Delzoun, the North Kingdom, which had fallen, but, was sort of an example of what a Shield Dwarf kingdom would look like. And one of the things that the Shield Dwarves had was something called the Everfire. I believe it was under Sundabar. And it was like a volcanic region where they could do their best forging. And so I didn't want to copy that, but I did want the Grey Dwarves to sort of be able to do the equivalent, to match what the Shield Dwarves could do. And so I decided that instead of doing something with, a volcano or whatever, that the breath weapon of a red dragon would sort of be the equivalent of the Everfire as an ingredient for forging Dwergar blades and armor. And that kind of led me to Themberchaud, who I called the Wormsmith of Gracklestugh. So that was the origin, was I wanted the Grey Dwarves to have an empire. I wanted them to be powerful. I wanted them to be able to build weapons and armor that was the equivalent of what the Shield Dwarves could do. And so Themberchaud was like sort of their secret weapon towards that end. And that was sort of the start of it. Does that make sense? I hope.
Absolutely.
I will say that this was pretty early in my writing career, and I have never been as good at names as Ed, particularly dragon names. But nonetheless, I'm still pretty happy with his name. I will admit it's secretly a portmanteau of thermo, ember, and chaud, which is sort of French for warm. And that's how I came up with Themberchaud. Would I still do that name today? Probably not. I probably email George Crashos or Ed and ask for some inspiration. but I like the name. It's good. So what I actually wrote back then was that he was a young adult red dragon of chaotic evil alignment, and that he lurks in a hidden side cavern on the south side of Gracklstug's central grotto atop a treasure hoard unseen by visitors. His fiery breath weapon tempers the legendary steel blades of Gracklstug in exchange for regular contributions to his hoard. And like his predecessors, the red dragon is attended by a monastic order of Duergar priests psionicists known as the Keepers of the Flame, and they cater to the dragon's every whim that falls within the pact between the young worm and the rulers of House Steel Shadow. That was the rulers of Gracklstug. So literally, that's all I wrote. But if you look back on it, you can kind of see the seeds of how we evolved from that first paragraph. So everybody knows that red dragons love treasure and they love gorging on food. But they can only seize so much gold because they got to fight people for it. And if they want to like chase after herds of deer or roth and the like, they have to spend energy flying around. So this guy's a little different from your stereotypical red dragon already. He has attendants. They supplement his hoard. Basically, he's on a salary, and they cater to his every need. So what else does he need besides treasure? Well, he needs food. So while I didn't say he was large and in charge, that was sort of my implication, was that, this guy probably gets everything he wants to eat. And this is really, I think, one of the best things about designing in a shared world. You can lay those seeds, and Ed does this better than anybody I know. And then other people can pick them up and go a little farther and go a little farther, whatever is logical. So, Themberchaud honestly was one of many dragons I've detailed, just like Ed has. Some of which take off and some of which go nowhere, and that's fine. And this is, he's an example of where by my count, at least half a dozen or more designers have tweaked and advanced his storyline far better than any one designer alone might come up with. And I'm sure you've had that same experience, Ed, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the beauty of the shared world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So to start, Bruce Cordell and his co-writers picked up the baton in the 3E era when they wrote a product called Underdark, which is kind of the successor to Dritz de Woerden's Guide to the Underdark. And they built on my initial words. They said, quote, "In return for this magnanimous service, Themberchaud's hoard is regularly fattened and he feasts on ill-tempered slaves." So now we're starting to follow the Realms Lord to its logical conclusion. A pampered house pet of a red dragon is going to get very fat very quickly. Then Eitan Bernstein, who had also collaborated with on Dragons of Faerun, he picked up Themberchaud again in an online article during the 3E era, part of the Class Chronicle series, and he was talking about psionics. That was his focus. So I had already mentioned a thieves guild called the Grey Ghosts in Dritz de Woerden's Guide to the Underdark, but I hadn't said much about them. So he introduced the concept of a war in the shadows between the Keepers of the Flame and the Grey Ghosts, and that the latter group, the Grey Ghosts, had organized a theft of an egg from Themberchaud's hoard. And this is curious, of course, because Themberchaud is male, which was actually pointed out in that article. So why did he have an egg in his hoard, and what was he going to do with it? Was it his offspring, or did the Duergar just procure it for him? Matt Forbeck later suggested it was his offspring, but that part's still a little bit unclear. So, but that's sort of, now we've got this, yet another thing here. Like there's this egg, which is, potentially being stolen, and what are we going to do about that? And what are the implications for the character? So now you get to the modern era, the 5e era, and the Out of the Abyss storyline, which is written by Chris Perkins and others. And in this sort of big sprawling adventure, the PCs visit Gracklstug, and they have a chance to visit with Themberchaud. So in this book, we learn that the Grey Ghost and the Keepers of the Flame are still fighting in the shadows, and that the Grey Ghost, quote, recently stole an egg from his hoard. Now, it's a little unclear whether it's the same egg or, given that a century has passed, a second egg. I think some of the later texts suggest it was just the one egg, and recently in this case means a century ago, followed by years and years of warfare between the gray ghosts and the keepers of the flame. So the whole succession plan that's worked for multiple multiple wormsmiths at this point is broken, right? They have this successor egg. It's been stolen by the gray ghosts for reasons unknown, and the keepers of the flame are really distracted battling the gray ghosts. And sort of into this sort of, this is how Themberchaud is different from his predecessors. And so we also learned from this product that the Dwergar planned to kill him. Now, this is another logical extension of what I wrote in the first place, right? There have been many wormsmiths, and obviously the gray dwarves can only handle them up until a certain point. Once they get too big and too powerful, it's too risky to keep them in the city. And this too strikes me as a logical extension of those early building blocks. So the succession planning for the gray dwarves appears to be convince your wormsmith to sire an egg and maybe even watch it for you, and then kill him when he gets too powerful and replace him with his offspring, and do this again and again and again. So you always have a young adult or adult red dragon around, and you probably have to kill them sometime between 100 and 150 years old and move on to the next one. So now what do we know? We also know that another thing red dragons like besides treasure and food is power. And despite having it pretty good in his gilded cage, Themberchaud, he really wants more. And so why limit himself to the treasures and food that the Dwergar deign to share with him when he can have it all and rule the city? On the other hand, like we learned in Matt's book, he's stuck. Physically, he's too fat to get out. But also, from a tactical perspective, if he turns on his handlers, he's likely to get killed. So in Out of the Abyss, you also learn that he's trying to recruit servants loyal only to him. He's figured out the Dwergar aren't telling him everything, but rather than just eat them, or demand that they tell him, he's being cautious and cunning. So now we're starting to learn that Themberchaud is cunning and practical, which is a really interesting thing to learn based on how he behaves later in the movie, right? Despite his bulk. As I mentioned, Matt Forbach's accompanying book, Escape the Underdark. We learned that Themberchaud was too big to escape Gracklestugh, so he's stuck. And while the adventure Out of the Abyss suggests that Themberchaud hopes to destroy the egg, Matt's book actually suggests he might instead let it hatch and raise the wormling to be loyal to him. And so, that part I think is a little bit left open for the DM to figure out what you want to do. Now, computer games, traditionally, we haven't really necessarily folded them into the Realms lore, but they're worth looking at just in case. And there was one that I haven't played called Sword Coast Legends, where apparently we learned that Themberchaud and the Deep King of House Steel Shadow were both taken over by an Illithid before they were liberated by an adventurer, the hero of the computer game. So again, you have another sort of disruption to this succession of wormsmiths. Themberchaud has been manipulated by an Illithid. He's starting to figure out that things aren't what they are. People have stolen the egg. So he's really different than all his predecessors. So kind of where does this leave us as the movie starts? Basically, we have a fat, cunning, spoiled red dragon who's aware that he lives in a gilded cage. He wants more power, more food, more treasure, and he's more cunning than impulsive. He's fought off domination by an Illithid. He doesn't trust his handlers, and he may even have an inkling that he will be killed like his predecessors by the Grey Dwarves before he becomes too big a threat, if he can't figure out a way to get out. And this is a dragon that wants out of all of this, is my feeling, by the end of 1491, when that adventure is over, right? So now, from that little tiny bit that I wrote, and a lot of really great authors taking it and making it much, much better, we have a pretty fully realized character that has a lot of motivations and history and backstory. Plus, you can answer the question, why now, right? To my mind, it's always important to know, why did the Orc Horde hit now and not next week and not last week? Why does this red dragon want out when a dozen predecessors didn't make it out? What was different about the story this time, right? So I think because of all the great things all those other designers have done, we've taken a character that was just a little minor footnote, one of many I was creating, and built him up into someone with motivations. And this is the part I think we're a little brainstorming, and I was hoping Ed would help me with this. Makes a lot of sense, because one of the most interesting things about the character the movie does is put him someplace else.
Right.
When you see him in the movie, he's not in Gracklestad. He's in Dolblund, which is a different city. It's an abandoned gnome city that I think fell in like the 500s or 600s.
But where is that located? Because Dolblund is underneath Waterdeep.
No.
Isn't it?
Nope.
And the map of the Underdark has it underneath Waterdeep.
Well, it depends. So,
or is it just underneath the high? Is it underneath the high forest?
Nope, not there either. So Dolblund.
So they're wrong.
Well,
maps are often wrong.
That's true. Okay.
Where I put Dolblund in the first place is sort of north of Daggerford and east of Waterdeep. Okay, on the eastern side of the Sword Mountains. So Ed had invented the city, and we're going to get to where he invented it in a second. But it's this abandoned gnome city, which I had tied into the history of Falorm, the Fallen Kingdom. It was founded by gnomes fleeing the fall of Garlanda, and they had joined into the Fallen Kingdom, sort of alongside the dwarves and the elves and the halflings and the humans. And it had fallen 500 or 600s DR, if I remember correctly. So we've got an old city, carved out of the depths of the earth by gnomes, similar to dwarves, and then it's abandoned, right? So now where I had placed it, the only place it actually got published was in a web enhancement. So sometimes, people don't treat those as canon as some of the more published products, but that's where we had put it. And there is some interesting, I was going to get to that as well. There's the interesting way that they escape and they find themselves on a seashore that raises some questions as well. But roughly that's where the city is. And I don't think the movie necessarily contradicts that location. It isn't really clear where it is until they escape, which I think you can talk about in a different way. But I think the interesting question for me, and Ed, I was hoping you could comment on this as well, is Ed had set this city up in the more modern era, meaning 1368 DR, as the lair of a different dragon. And Ed, do you want to talk about him a little bit?
Don't you go anywhere now. Ain't nobody say what I own. Sky limit gonna get everything now. I'm taking it. I say don't you go anywhere now. Ain't nobody say what I own. Sky limit gonna get everything now. I'm taking it. La 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 la.